Okay, so our next part of the process is to actually, now that we've got it all quilted, is to actually trim off this excess backing and the wadding, and we're going to try and straighten up our table runner as much as possible. I usually like to use a really long ruler. I've got a lovely 24-inch ruler, but I'm trying to use things perhaps that you're more likely to have at home. So this is just a normal sort of small, it's only 12-inch ruler. I've got a rotary cutter. I much prefer this ergonomic one that basically the blade is only out when you've got your hands pressed on it. As soon as you let go, the blade is in and safe. I have a cutting mat. That's a self-healing cutting mat. It has seen better days, but it's going to do perfectly for what we need to do today. And obviously my quilted item. So let's get going. As I said, when I have a longer ruler, you have a bit better chance of making sure you've got a nice sort of straight side. My tip is to try and cut or trim your project from one of your quilting lines or from one of the actual seam lines in your project. I don't know whether you can quite see, but some of these charm squares weren't quite 5 inches exactly, and there's a bit of wonkiness on my outside where that piece comes in here and then this piece is quite a bit different. So lining up to the outside of where your fabric is may not be the best thing, and we're looking for something that's perhaps more visually correct as opposed to perhaps being perfectly correct. So I might use this seam that comes through here. Now obviously it isn't there, but my quilting line is actually pretty close to that seam, so I might use that. So I'm going to try and see. Now I actually trim to the very edge. I don't try and trim 1/4 inch out or anything like that, because when I get to my binding, I make a slightly smaller binding, but we'll talk about that in the binding video. So I'm thinking from that seam here, I'm going to line it up for 2 1/4 inches on my ruler, and I've then continued down on my quilting line, which as I said is in line with that seam as well. Got it nice and straight. I'm going to put my hand safely out of the way, get my rotary cutter, and I'm just going to go all the way out to the end, roll that back, and then I'm going to move my project up a little bit. Get it nice and flat again. Make sure that any extra backing is actually out, it's not underneath, and you're not trying to sort of cut things in funny spots. I'm going to continue lining up. Trim that. Come down here. Now, if you don't have a seam to line up with or some quilting lines to line up with, and you're just looking at measuring from your ruler, try and perhaps have your, instead of just doing, starting here where the last cut is, having it up a bit further, so you've got a little bit of opportunity to line up with your previous cut, so you're not going to get sort of wonky cuts, etc. That can be very helpful as well. Okay, here's my last cut for that side, and that goes in the scrap bin. Now I'm going to turn it around, and I'm going to do a similar thing here. But because we've decided that was going to be our line and we were measuring exactly out from that, that means that side is now straight. So when I come to turn around, I'm actually going to have my ruler up a little bit so that I can have that line being nice and square with my straight line, and then whatever I come down here, and you can see this bit's sort of a bit more fabric here than there is up here, that gives me a chance to square things up as much as I can. So I think that might be it. And here I'm going to use that, lining up my ruler up here with the cut so that I'm continuing to be straight. And there's another bit that's off into the scrap bin. Then I'm going to turn around and continue to do the same thing. And I'm going to use that seam again that was about the 2 1/4 inch mark. Almost there. Oops, moved it. There we go. Third side done. Just got this last side to go. And again, I'm going to use the fact that, and I might actually use the first side so that I can keep things nice and straight to that first side. Going to line up that inch line there with the edge of that quilt or the table runner. And then line up my ruler nice and straight. And there we go. There we have our lovely table runner all trimmed, and we're ready to put some binding on. Right, now we're ready to cut some binding for our little table runner, our project. And I just have a fat quarter of, it's actually Happy Go Lucky by Bonnie and Camille, which was a nice old line. And because it is, and it's got the selvage on it, I'm actually going to trim the selvage off because I do like keeping selvages. And it's not going to make much difference to my size of my cuts and things for my binding. So I'm just going to take the selvage off, plus about 1/2 inch of the fabric, and I keep those. And I'm hoping one day to make a lovely couple of selvage quilts. So I am now going to cut my fabric for my binding. I try and take the longest side. And this is pretty much going to end up being square, I would suggest, now that I've taken that off. It's about 20 inches by 18 inches. So my 20 inch, so the longer side, I'm going to fold it in half that way so that I'm going to get strips that are about 20 inches long. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to cut fabric, but I like using my ruler because my cutting mats now are getting fairly worn. The lines have been used many times and are starting to get quite wide, so I can't measure accurately, whereas rulers are a little more hardy. So the very first thing I'm going to do, from that fold, where I've folded it, I've tried obviously to get that top of that fabric as evenly as possible. So that fold is now a straight line. We're going to take that as being straight. And what I want to do first is trim off this right hand side just to get that nice and straight as well. And then we'll be able to start cutting. So again, I'm using one of the lines across my ruler. It happens to be the 1 inch mark. It's got a nice line there. And that then means that this is straight. And I'm just going to trim off that little tiny bit of fabric, and so now I have 2 straight sides and I can start cutting. Now I am right-handed, so I'm going to flip my fabric around, hopefully without fiddling too much with that nice straight cut. But if I have, I just use a bit of fingernail just to make sure that that's nicely in line again. And I'm going to cut my binding at 2 1/4 inches. So 1, 2 1/4, and that line I'm going to line up with the very left-hand side of the fabric, put my hand in place, and cut one of my strips. And I'm going to repeat. Now how many strips you need depends obviously on the size of your project. For the girls that are watching this who've been doing my little beginner's course, I will let you know exactly how many strips of fabric you need to cut for your little table runner. Two and a quarter, lining up. because this is a fat quarter, I'm going to have to do just a few. Okay, so now we need to go across to the sewing machine because we've got to sew these strips together. I'll see you over there. Okay, so I'm going to put the two fabrics together, and I'm actually going to put some pins in just to hold it. Now when you get a bit better at doing this, you perhaps won't need the pins, but I'll show you what the basics look like. And we're going to sew from that line to this line, so it's where the corners of your fabrics meet, so that corner to that corner. Now when you first do this, I would suggest ruling a line with a pencil or a fabric marker that will disappear. I don't have one handy, and I actually do it by eye, so I'm going to just go for it. So what I like to do, and by the way, I've still got my walking foot on from when I was doing my quilting, and I leave it on even though I'm doing this, because when we finish doing the binding in a minute, I'm going to put it onto the quilt and I'll need the walking foot on anyway, so I'm just going to leave it on. So I'm just going to put my foot down, and then I'm going to put the needle down, and right in that corner where the two pieces of fabric meet, and I'm then lining up, and this is why that diagonal seam tape is really handy. The diagonal seam tape has a red line that comes out right where the needle is, so all you need to do is then line up that corner with your diagonal seam tape red line, and sew. Okay, now I could get one out, but I've got a million more to do, so what I want to show you is then taking your piece of fabric and just turning it over like this. So then your right side of fabric is facing upwards. We haven't got any twists or anything else. We've just turned it over just once. We've got our right side of fabric there, and I'm going to go and grab my next strip, right sides together, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I like to lift my foot up and pull my other strip out a little bit so that I can slide this one in. My needle is in the down position, so I know exactly where the fabric's corner is, the fabrics are meeting. I can put my foot down and I can then line it up and do my second piece. Going to flatten that fabric out, just flip it over that once so that my right side's up, and rinse and repeat. We're going to continue this on until I've done all of my strips. Pull that out, line it up with that corner, just make sure I haven't, and that's why putting the pins in is handy. You know, as I'm putting it underneath, this piece can move a bit, whereas if you've got your pins in, that won't move, and you're very sure then that it's kept at the 90 degrees. Flatten that out, flip it over, right sides together with my next piece. Down in that corner, straighten that up, straighten that line up. Flatten out, flip it over. Becomes very therapeutic after a little while. Lift up, put in the corner, straighten up. Flatten out, fold over, and I'm on my last strip already. Gosh, that went quickly. Lift up in that corner, foot down, straighten it up. Okay, we can now cut. Lift my foot up, and I'm going to grab some scissors. You can go over your rotary cutter and your mat, but I just find it's much easier just sitting here to do what you need to do. First of all, I trim between the different strips, and I make sure I put my hand in here. That's making sure that this strip and that strip are going in the right spots. I haven't got any extra fabric behind here that I might accidentally cut. And I'm just going to cut about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more, away from that seam line. Trim off that little dog ear, and there's a little dog ear down the bottom as well. They can go over to one side, and that's now ready to press. I'm now going to move to the next one. Trim between, flatten that out, cut. Cut off the little dog ears, and you guessed it, rinse and repeat. There we go, getting close, a couple more to go. Well, that's going to go in the scrap bin in a minute. 2 more to go, 1/4 of an inch away. And here's the last one. Okay, so it's going to go in my scrap bin. So let's just have a look at what it looks like. Obviously we need to press it, and I press open in a minute, but this is what my seam looks like. Nice, even, the pieces of fabric are lined up well, ready to go. Let's go to the ironing board. Okay, so here we are over at the ironing board, and here's our seam that we just sewed a moment ago. And I open them up and press them. It makes for a much flatter seam and allows us to, well, almost disappears, especially on this patterned fabric where you can't really see it. So what we're doing, apart from pressing those open, is we're actually going to fold our fabric, our binding fabric, in half and press it. So as we go along, I'm just moving with this left hand a little bit so that the raw edges line up at the top. Doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but try and get the raw edges reasonably close together. And just move along. Here's another seam, so I'll press that first. And then come back here and continue my folding in half. And we need to do this for the whole lots of binding strips that you've created. Fold them open, press, and then come back and fold the whole strip in half. Try to keep your strip reasonably straight on your ironing board. There is a bit of give in the fabric the way we've cut it, nowhere near as much as if you've cut it on the bias, obviously, but it is possible to get a bit of a curve in it. It's not really critical if you do that, but certainly a bit better if you try and keep it as straight as possible. This is a lovely time and opportunity to have a good look at the fabric. Think how great it's going to look as you're binding. Really looking forward to getting this little project finished. I'm wondering who to give it to. Okay, we're almost done on the binding. Here we go. There is all of our binding nicely pressed in half. So now's the time to put the binding onto the table runner.